On the 8th of October 2016, Lucia Perez was discarded at the Playa Serena Hospital in Argentina. The 16-year-old had no vital signs and was barely clinging to life. The men who pushed her from their van yelled to the staff that she had overdosed on drugs and had fainted. After dumping her, they sped off into the night. While nurses and doctors rushed to administer life-saving treatments, they made a shocking realization. The young girl showed clear signs of having been essayed. Stranger still, it appeared that Lucia's body had recently been cleaned. This is the story of a woman who is blamed for her own murder. Lucia Perez Montero was born on Valentine's Day in the year 2000 in Mar del Plata, Argentina. This city is 400 kilometers or 260 miles to the south of Buenos Aires. Lucia's parents, Guillermo and Marta Montero, already had a son, Matias, and their daughter was the perfect addition to complete their family. As a child, Lucia was talkative and social. She kept an eye on everyone around her and was the first to offer help if she saw someone in need. Lucia enjoyed going to school, where she discovered her talent for drawing. When she was a little older, her art drew the attention of a local college, and she was offered a scholarship to study visual arts. But Lucia had a different dream. She had loved animals for as long as her parents could remember. But when she was gifted a German shepherd named Gemma, Lucia's dreams of working with animals were solidified. Lucia and Gemma were inseparable from day one, and she told her parents that when she finished school, she was going to study to become a vet so she could be around animals every day. Her parents knew Lucia was a strong-willed and independent young woman, and they had no doubt she would go on to achieve her dreams. Lucia and her brother Matias were extremely close. Even as they reached their teenage years, there was none of the sibling rivalry present in many families. She was also very close to her mum, who she would talk to every day, no matter what. Whenever their schedules allowed, they would curl up on the couch together and share a cup of traditional bitter tea and talk about everything and anything. In fact, Lucia was one of those people who was close with everyone, her dad, her grandparents, her friends, and her neighbours. Life in the Montero house was about as normal as it could be in Argentina. The family didn't have a lot, but their small home was filled with love. Each day, their father would drop Lucia and Matias at school on his way to work at a sheet metal factory, while Marta headed off to her varying shifts as a nurse. The children would walk home from school for lunch and return for their afternoon classes. When Matias finished high school and headed off to study law at university, he took over the role of dropping his sister at school on the way to classes. During their drives together, they would talk about everything from school to music and their dreams. Until one day, when all of Lucia's dreams were taken away. On the 8th of October 2016, Lucia Perez was pushed out of a van into the forecourt of the Playa Serena Hospital in Argentina. Nurses and doctors rallied around, and in their attempts to revive her, they realized this was far from a typical overdose. Her body showed signs of SA, and also of having been washed or cleaned. Despite the best efforts of medical staff at the hospital, 40 minutes after Lucia was abandoned, she passed away. When the doctors rang the police to notify them of the death, they were able to identify Lucia, and her family were called to say she had been in an accident and that they needed to get to the hospital right away. While they were being told the devastating news of Lucia's death, medical staff were telling the police about what they had seen underneath Lucia's clothing. They told the officers that Lucia had been impaled. When you hear that word, you might think they were referring to her having a piece of metal through her flesh, but they were talking about something much more horrific. In Argentina, the word impaled refers to sodomization. This meant Lucia's death was clearly a murder. Unlike for many female victims of homicide in Argentina, the investigation got underway relatively quickly. Officials used CCTV footage to identify the van used to drop her at the hospital, which led them to Matias Gabriel Farias and Juan Pablo Ofidani. The very next day, they tracked down the vehicle itself, and when they looked inside the van, officers found condoms, drugs, ammunition, and sex toys. Matias and Juan stuck to the story they had given when they abandoned Lucia at the hospital. They said she had fainted, but this time they added that Lucia had taken a lot of drugs and had sex with them as well. They told officers the whole incident was consensual and that Lucia had fainted during sex. Being the good people that they were, they immediately took her to the hospital for treatment. They offered no explanation as to why it appeared that Lucia had been washed before they took her for help. The statement from the two men, as well as the evidence from the vehicle and Lucia's body, simply didn't match the story that they were giving. When investigators looked more closely at the evidence, it pointed to a vastly different version of events. Lucia had met Matias for the first time just 1 day prior to her murder. Matias was a known drug dealer, and one of Lucia's friends had given her his number to buy weed. After connecting on Facebook, the pair met up outside her school to exchange the drugs. After the deal was done, they had gone their separate ways. That should have been the end of their relationship, but on the day of her murder, Matias contacted Lucia on Facebook and asked if she wanted to come over to his house for some free weed. After a bit of convincing, Lucia agreed. Matias arranged for his friend Juan to pick her up from outside her house and drive her over to his place, where he told her he had a surprise waiting for her. When Lucia arrived, there was another man there who Matias introduced as Alejandro. Matias was 23 years old, but the other two men were much older. Alejandro was 61 and Juan was 41, and their presence immediately made her uncomfortable. To help Lucia relax, Matias and the others offered her weed and then some cocaine. With her guard down, they continued to feed her with more and more drugs until she began to lose consciousness. Once Lucia was beyond the point of being able to fight back or consent, the attack began. The men took turns SAing her. Then they took turns using a wooden pole to brutally sodomize her. This part of the attack caused the internal injuries which would later result in her death. At some point, the men realized Lucia was more than unconscious, so they washed her body and put her clothes back on. Then they shoved her into the back of a van and drove to the clinic, where they discarded her like a piece of trash. Lucia's autopsy revealed that her cause of death was pulmonary edema and pulmonary congestion combined with cocaine poisoning. Effectively, she had died from blood loss and a heart attack. The report also noted that her body showed signs of sexual activity. Investigators were now certain that the three men had each played a role in Lucia's death. Matias and Juan were arrested and charged with murder, and a few days later, Alejandro was arrested for his part in covering up what had happened. Soon after the arrests, Lucia's brother revealed that he and his family believed there were more than 3 people involved in Lucia's brutal SA and murder. He wrote a post on Facebook where he claimed that 2 armed men turned up at his parents' home and warned them to stop the investigation. Matias posted an open letter to his Facebook page which stated, quote, "I would have liked to publish along with this letter a photo of me laughing with my sister, or a photo of her hugging my parents. But no, we can't, because while we try to process that she was killed the way she was, we have to process the death threats that fall on all of us. My sister was a quiet girl. She did not often leave the house, and on the weekend she died, She had been picked up from home at 10 a.m. My father had just left the house, and my mother had returned 4 hours later at 3 p.m. She found my sister's Facebook account still open because she had only expected to be away for a short while when she went to meet whoever she had spoken to on Facebook. But she had been cheated and she never returned. This time, gender violence touched Lucia, but the next time it could be you or the person you love most in this world. We have to be strong and get out into the street, scream all together now more than ever, not one less." End quote. After Matthias put the letter up on Facebook, an officer was posted to guard Lucia's family home, but no further arrests were made. News about Lucia's death spread quickly across Argentina. It was just the latest in a string of murders which highlighted the terrifying frequency of violence against women. The day after her death, thousands of protesters dressed in black participated in a 1-hour sit-in to demand justice for Lucia. The lack of action taken to protect women from femicide has been a problem in Argentina since long before Lucia's murder. Prior to 2009, the rates of murder amongst women were so high that a law was introduced which was intended to prevent and punish violence against women specifically. The law gave authorities more power to arrest, charge and convict those accused of crimes against women. But the new law had little effect. The number of women killed continued to grow, but the reality of gender-based killings was hidden amongst the general classification of murder. It was only in 2012, after a 40% increase in female homicides the year before, that the crime of femicide was written into criminal law. This change enabled a more accurate representation of how many women were being killed, by whom, and what punishment their killers were facing. The law also included a new provision for those who kill women to be able to be sentenced to life imprisonment. Femicide is defined as the intentional killing of a woman by a man because of her gender. Whilst women are murdered at a far higher rate than men across most of South America, not all cases of homicide against women are considered femicide. The murder of a woman can only be considered femicide when a certain set of criteria are met. These criteria include evidence of sexual violence prior to the victim's death, or a sentimental, affective, or trusting relationship with the perpetrator, or the victim's body being displayed in public. Despite femicide being highlighted as a problem in Argentina, little has been done to actually prevent it from happening in the first place. In 2021 alone, 231 women lost their lives in acts of femicide. Only 6 of these women's killers were convicted. Not 6%, 6 total killers. And these aren't the only numbers which cause concern. Between 2008 and 2022, 4,131 murders have been classified as femicide, and it remains the leading cause of premature death in women. It is estimated that 75% of these deaths are committed by men close to the victim, whether a family member, friend, romantic partner, or ex-partner. To put that in context, 1 woman will die in an act of femicide every 29 hours in Argentina. Even though the new laws were intended to offer investigative powers after a femicide has been committed, for many victims and their families, they cannot even get the cases investigated, let alone solved. There are extensive reports of families undertaking their own investigations, being ignored by investigators, and authorities themselves contaminating the crime scenes. And then there are the cases where even when the killers are identified and proven to be involved, the victim's personality is called into question and they are painted not as the victim, but as an active participant in their own death. And that is exactly what happened to Lucia. Even though her case was covered extensively in the media, and there was extreme public pressure for an investigation, it took 2 years for Lucia's murderers to face trial. Unlike in the justice systems of other countries, where a jury of people determine the outcome, Lucia's trial was presided over by a panel of 3 male judges. Right from the outset, it was clear that these men would offer no justice for Lucia. There is no clearer example of how society views women in Argentina than the way Lucia was represented during the trial, and the way in which this was not only enabled, but encouraged by the judges. Right away, the defense lawyers painted Lucia as a drug addict who had a habit of sleeping around. They used her school record to show that she frequently skipped classes so she could go out and take drugs. Then they used text messages to prove that she had been known to have sex with men up to the age of 29 years old, like that was somehow relevant to the fact that she had died of internal bleeding caused by sodomization. Then they argued that forensic doctors all agreed that Lucia's body showed no signs of sexual assault, only consensual intercourse. They stated their opinion like it was fact, that an autopsy can somehow determine consent. Those same lawyers repeated their clients' stories that Lucia had been a willing participant and that there was no indication that she had not consented to intercourse. Even though her blood results showed a toxic level of cocaine, the defense argued that that wouldn't have stopped her from being able to say no if she wanted to. They claimed she had accidentally taken too much cocaine, and that during their violent but consensual sex session, her heart had given out and she became unconscious. The men were shocked that she was unresponsive, so they dropped her off at a nearby rehabilitation clinic and ran away. As for the cause of death, the defense claimed that there was no sodomization. In their opinion, Lucia had died from overdosing on cocaine, which she had willingly consumed and which had caused her heart to stop. They even managed to turn testimony from those who knew Lucia into ammunition for their defense. When Lucia's brother testified that she had a strong and independent personality, those qualities were used against her. Quote, "We can attest clearly the level of self-determination that Lucia had. She had a personality that is anything but submissive. Her own brother testified that she had a strong personality and that she hid details of her sex life from her own mother. She was not the sort of person that could easily be pressured into having sex without her consent. Even though she was young, she had enough capacity to say no." End quote. To prove these points, the lawyers turned to text messages taken from Lucia's phone where she turned down men who were looking for sex. They used suggestive photos she had sent to prove that she was actively looking for sex with random men and to, quote, "dispel completely the possibility that she could have been sexually assaulted." End quote. While Lucia's private life was dissected down to the most intimate detail, the same rules did not apply to her attackers. When one of the defendants was questioned about his porn use, the judges stopped the line of questioning, saying that it violated his right to intimacy and privacy, a right which those very same judges didn't feel should be extended to Lucia. With Lucia's reputation torn to shreds, there was little the prosecution could say to convince the judges that she didn't deserve to die. They argued that the medical reports showed her cause of death wasn't just from taking drugs. They tried to show the judges that the injuries on her body were so severe that no person could ever reasonably consent to such treatment, But their argument was of little use. The judges acquitted all 3 men of murder. The ruling came as little surprise given how Lucia had been treated throughout the trial. To add insult to injury, the judges attempted to explain their reasoning. They cited a lack of evidence to prove that the intercourse between Lucia and her killers was not consensual. Without proof that Lucia didn't consent to be drugged, raped, and sodomized, there was no proof of murder, and therefore the men couldn't be convicted. But this gets worse. In the judge's ruling, they determined that Lucia was, quote, unrapeable, end quote. That is literally the word they used to justify her treatment. Despite the brutal trauma evident on every part of her 16-year-old body, Lucia apparently had some mysterious layer of protection surrounding her, which would have prevented SA from being able to occur. In their opinion, she had consented to the whole lot. Quote, everything was normal and natural. It was all perfectly wanted and consented to by Lucia Perez. In this case, there has been no physical or psychological violence, subordination or humiliation, and least of all, objectification. End quote. After all of that, it was little consolation that the judges found Matias and Juan guilty of supplying drugs to a minor. For these crimes, they were sentenced to 8 years in prison and given a fine equivalent to $3,000. Effectively, the message was, we take drug dealing more seriously than sexual assault and murder. After the verdict and the sentencing, Lucia's father Guillermo commented, quote, I am surprised, but why wouldn't I be? I never expected a sentence like that. It makes no sense. My daughter's autopsy revealed everything they had done to her. The fact that she had bruising in her vagina, all sorts of things, and they claim they couldn't prove it? This is nonsense. End quote. Her mother Marta stated that the sentence was like Lucia being murdered all over again. Quote, so they didn't SA her. They didn't kill her. They didn't drug her. What was my daughter's death? A gift? They are going to do it again. There are many other girls hanging around. The fact that a court only cares about the drugs and does not acknowledge the life of a person, Lucia's femicide, is shameful. The message they are sending to society is, continue killing girls. It's all right. Nothing's going to happen to you. Lucia's death didn't even exist. End quote. It wasn't just Lucia's family who felt outraged about the unjust ruling. The acquittal of her killers came 1 year after another high-profile femicide where the perpetrator was also set free. In that case, the ruling prompted Argentina's biggest ever demonstration and led to the formation of the Ni Una Menos, Not One Less movement, which is Argentina's equivalent of the Me Too movement. Both of these cases highlighted a number of foul truths about the justice system in Argentina. Women's lives are not valued equally to men's. Supplying drugs is considered worse than SA, and a person's supposed morality before their death justifies their demise. Days after the judge's announcement in Lucia's case, her parents led nationwide protests against the ruling. The marches were attended by thousands of women and men who felt that the ruling was yet another example of the justification of violence against women. As a result of the protests, lawyers acting on behalf of Lucia's family appealed the ruling. In 2020, the appeals court annulled both men's acquittals on the grounds that they were decided based on gender stereotypes, not on the evidence. They ordered a new trial which got underway in early 2023. At around the same time, the magistrate's prosecution jury also announced that a hearing into the judge's conduct would be opened. They immediately suspended all 3 judges involved in Lucia's case and docked their pay by 40%. Quote, in the first trial, They didn't judge the facts around Lucia's death, but rather her life, the way that she lived as a teenager. The sentence was about a moral judgment, lacking a gender perspective." End quote. The promise of a retrial offered little comfort for Lucia's family. They had no hope that 3 new judges would rule any differently than the first. Society had not miraculously changed in the years since their daughter's death. Women were still being murdered frequently, they were still being blamed for their own deaths, and their killers were still being set free. There was also the fact that one of the accused, Alejandro, had died by then, and he would never face justice for what he had done to Lucia. Her family were right to be apprehensive. The judge in the new case ruled that Lucia's family could not be present in the courtroom for the trial. Instead, they were seated in a small side room where they could watch the proceedings on a tiny monitor. Yet again, the defence lawyers requested that the men be acquitted because there was no proof that Lucia hadn't consented to sexual intercourse or to taking the drugs which had caused her heart to stop. They also argued that the social controversy surrounding the case meant that the judges would be biased in their findings. Once again, the prosecution repeated its position that Lucia had been drugged, raped, and sodomized, and all of this had been without her consent. They sought a guilty finding, and that Matthias be sentenced to life imprisonment, and Juan be sentenced to at least 20 years. 28 witnesses were called in the 2-week trial, and right up until the moment that the ruling was handed down, no one was sure which way it would go. There was an audible sigh of relief when the judges ruled in Lucia's favour. Matthias was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison for sexual abuse, supplying narcotics, and femicide. Juan was found guilty of being an accessory to the crime and sentenced to 8 years. When Lucia's mother was asked about her feelings toward these new convictions, she offered these words, quote, "If you ask me what I feel, I have to tell you that I am not happy. No, I am not happy. I have a dead daughter. It does not give me joy. It does give me peace of mind that we are doing justice. We achieve it together between men and women, walking, knocking on doors, wearing shoes, as I like to say, carrying signs, raising flags, showing news, fighting from the networks. It is an achievement of all." End quote. As for the judges in the original trial, they each faced charges of negligence, breach of office duties, and manifest bias. Unfortunately, one of the 3 judges was able to retire before the charges were filed, and he therefore avoided being prosecuted in the case. All 3 men claim that their conduct and their findings were justified, and that it is only because of politics that their ruling was called into question. Lucia's death was just one in a long list of women who have been killed, blamed, and vilified in Argentina. Despite the outpouring of support from international agencies, lawyers, and politicians, the rate of women experiencing violence in the country hasn't slowed down. Guillermo and Marta have since started an NGO which tracks femicides and advocates for female victims of violence in Argentina. But amongst their advocacy work, there remains an empty seat at their table and a dog who pines for its master. The final words of Lucia's story belong to her brother, quote, "What was Lucia like? She loved art, rock music, and animals. There she would be, in every verse of a Viegas Locas song, bopping along, hugging an abandoned pet, always smiling, cuddling her dog, sending out good vibrations in every direction, just because. We will continue fighting for Lucia and all the Lucias. This does not end here." End quote.